Thank you, Tyler. Hey, everybody. And please join me in welcoming Guillermo. Hey, Guillermo.
How's it going? Thanks, Tanmai and Hasura, for having me.
Absolutely. And of course, I would be remiss if not to congratulate you and the entire Vercel team and the community on just an amazing job so far and your amazing fundraise.
Thank you.
So, hoping for amazing things to come. What does it feel like? What's the plan for what are some of the big plans that you can share with us on what's coming up this year?
Yeah, for sure. It's very relevant to the topic of our fireside chat because we're talking about prototyping and production and moving fast. So we shared 3 goals broadly, and obviously these are just 3, and there's a lot that we're going to do over the years. But number 1 is continuing to create this concept of a standard development kit or SDK for the web. We think that React has become a very formidable standard together with Next.js, especially for websites and web applications. And we're going to continue to invest in that. We want to give companies like the recipe for success. Obviously, the web is a very diverse and rich ecosystem, so there's lots and lots of awesome frameworks that we support as well. But we think that the momentum is there and it's worth investing in trying to have at least the vast majority of companies in the world not have to reinvent the wheel when it comes down to front-end development. Number 2 is more relevant to the concept of prototyping that is in the title of our conversation, which is we want to lower the barrier to entry. So we already kind of launched a tech preview of what we call Next.js Live, which is an example of this goal, which basically Next Live allows you to, with one click, load up the development environment of your Next.js application, even inside a web browser. And you can make quick edits or comments without even being a dev, right? You can edit copy as easily as you would in a design tool. So we want to invest a lot more in that direction, just lower the barrier to entry. Even if you're a coder, I think I can speak for most coders that they don't enjoy installing Node, cloning, especially when they want to make quick changes, running Yarn and all that. And then finally, with regards to productions, we want to make the web as a whole faster for the end user. So we think that dev tools are great. Obviously, I'm a huge dev tool nerd. I love Next.js, React, all these things, but we have to deliver products that are great for end users. So the last goal for us is to focus on the end user. Let's create great things together. If you use Hasura Next, you have to keep that end user in mind at all times, and Vercel will try to help you.
No, that's awesome. That makes it sound, and I think those 3 values, right, really kind of align well with stuff that we're doing and stuff that I think in general is the direction that we're heading in, right? We have to kind of reduce some of that complexity of this complicated beast, right, that we have with the web, and so we need we need to kind of move towards some amount of standardization and some amount of automation, and articulating that as a web SDK is amazing. Lowering that barrier to entry so that more people can do stuff, right? We shouldn't be 20 million developers, right? We should be 100 million developers in the world or something.
Billions, for sure.
So I think, and I think that aligns a lot. And of course, one of those central problems, and even when it is close to that barrier of entry and the web SDK, right, is that theme around performance, right? You just need that to be taken care of so that you can just go ahead and do stuff and not worry about performance kind of being a thing that you have to worry about.
Yeah, I was going to say, what I think a lot of people always worry about churn of tools, right? If I bet on GraphQL, am I going to have to do new graph thing in 2 years? And I think the antidote to that is to focus on that end user, because you're not going to be thinking about changing stacks or rewriting your app if your app is performing well for the end user. So I think if you're focused on that, I think, with innovations like GraphQL and Next, we are focused on that. GraphQL comes from that desire at Facebook to not just improve the developer experience, but to deliver, really, really fast mobile experiences, for example.
Exactly. No, exactly. I think, and that really helps kind of think about these migrations and rewrites, right? When people are thinking about I have this existing application, I need to move it to something new, I need to build something new. You can kind of get lost in the world that we have today, where there's just so much happening every single day, and kind of just focusing on, your end user and trying to work backwards from that to see what do you need to do in those different timeframes, right, is becomes really useful. And so kind of on that theme, right, when you think about when we were chatting earlier, right, and we were thinking about like ways to kind of discuss the various topics that we have today, right? And you mentioned the word prototyping in production, which I just love, right? Which is a really, really nice way of thinking about the future of the way we want teams to work, right? What does prototyping in production mean to you, right? Like, what does it?
For sure.
What parts of it are technology? What parts of it are humans? What part of it is process? What is that for you?
Yeah, for me, one of the key insights there that I lived through this myself when I was working on Next.js is that at the end of the day, no one has all the answers for any given product challenge. One good example with this is there's no given expert in web performance that you can hire that knows everything about web performance that's going to make your site fast. As a result, in Next.js, we just announced our conformance system that basically aggregates all the knowledge and all the guardrails and all the rules from all the experts in the world, for example, like image optimization experts, and it serves those as automation into the Next.js model. So basically what that means is that you have to always be validating your hypothesis in production with your end users, with the real experience. Another example of this is when we launched analytics on Vercel, we started with giving you what we call the real experience score. So basically we grab performance data from the device or of how fast it takes to render a page. Right. And then we tell you, well, that page that you're working on is a 50 or an 80 or a 90. So this is another example of like, you don't know what could be costing the 50 perhaps. Like there's just so much going on in this world. And I think when it comes down to this concept of prototyping or experimenting in production, I think we should all be almost like more humble about what we know or what we think we know. And instead be more curious about, okay, I'm going to land this experiment in this Next.js page. It's going to be enabled for a subset of users. It's going to use this new GraphQL API that I just launched. And then I'm going to evaluate whether that is working out or not in production. And actually, speaking of GraphQL and Next, I have a really good anecdote here. One of the earliest users of Next.js was Trulia, the online marketplace in the US and beyond for real estate. And Zillow, they were both part of the Zillow group. So when Trulia, the CTO of Trulia contacted me, he had this concept of like, I have this intuition that the future is going to be React. It's going to be server-side rendering or hybrid. And he liked Next.js. And then he said, but I need to modernize my data layer because we're moving off of a PHP monolith. So they had struggled to modernize the front end without modernizing the data layer. So they were modernizing both. They were saying like, okay, we're going to switch to a microservice architecture. We're going to expose all this data through a GraphQL API, and we're going to use Next.js on the front end. But what I think was really smart that he did is he tested it out with one page. And actually they prototyped it. So speaking of the title of our presentation, prototype production, they prototyped it during a hack week. So they were like, okay, Next.js is going to govern the login page. They launched the login page as an experiment to a percentage of their users. And even with just a login page, they validated they were having more logins, better performance, fewer errors, fewer timeouts. And then they would say, okay, like this GraphQL plus Next.js thing makes sense. So that's what, to me, it means to be experimental in production.
Yeah. No, I think that's kind of amazing because I think that's also where, I mean, it's like that combination, right, of having a API-fied data layer, right, and having a fast stack on the edge, right, that you can experiment with quickly. That is focused on the end user is really really important, right? Because the way that when I think about like how we're evolving, right, it seems like we're it's like this dumbbell kind of thing that's happening, right? It's like we know that we're going to have centralized data and centralized data across a bunch of places. That's not going to go away because, I mean, maybe that is, but that's a different conversation, right? But in the way that we have applications today, right, that notion of central data is really important to collaboration, to logic, and to way things work. And on the other side, right, we're seeing kind of everything moving closer and closer to the edge because that's where the users actually are, right? That's where
Correct.
they are consuming their experiences. So the importance of being able to move fast on both of those pieces is
on
necessary,
both sides, correct?
right? And that becomes really important. And in that way, kind of that middle layer of being able to say, what if we don't have to deal with all of the nonsense of the way the data works, right? It's so complex. There's so many things happening.
Yeah.
Can we abstract that into an API, right? So that on the edge, we're getting this guarantee of performance and security for the data layer so that we can then focus on performance and the end user application that is relevant to the user, whether it's an API powered by, like, say, Next functions, right? Or whether it's an end application, right? And that edge movement becomes, I think it's really is happening, and it needs that data layer to exist.
Yeah, another way in which I see that symmetry is Next allows you to be, Next is basically the front end layer.
Mm-hmm.
And then it doesn't have a lot of opinions baked in about like how your UI works, how you integrate third-party scripts and third-party components. It gives you the right boundaries and frameworks and schematisms, but then on basically it's very experimental in nature. It's a layer and it connects to other things. On the data layer, you want to do the same thing, right? Like if I want to experiment with SQLite timescale Yugabyte, I can start, I have the confidence I have a data layer that is ergonomic and that is cohesive to the consumers, whether it's a front end or even whether it's third-party API consumers, right?
Correct.
But then it's allowing you to like basically witness the evolution of different experiments or parts of the underlying system. And that's how I see Next as well, because Next allows you to say, well, this page is going to try a new component system. This page is going to try a new sort of data fetching system. This or a state management system, which is something we see a lot in the real world, or CSS in JS. So you start saying, oh, well, I'm comparing all these entry points into my application side by side, and I'm co-evolving them. And I think that's basically what allows that experimentation to happen in the real world.
Exactly. And I think also kind of, you know, the one of the ways that I like thinking about these things, right, is that what we essentially want to do is create an environment, right? Whether it's technology or I mean, most often it's technology or driven by technology, but whether it's process, is to create a culture of kind of empowering people who can do stuff, right? And when we kind of think about it from a business point of view, you basically want to empower developers to say, you know, go prototype in production, go run experiments, go launch a page at a time, a feature at a time,
absolutely.
or change things, right? And we want to empower them as much as possible, but we just need the critical things to be de-risked. Right? As long as that de-risking is kind of baked in, right? You can just let people do whatever, right? And that kind of aligns really well, right? With like the way that you're thinking about, the way that you've been executing on the team has been executing on the way Next.js is evolving, right? To say we want to have that default SDK which solves a bunch of hard problems. We want to have a bunch of performance stuff that's baked in. It de-risks that ability to say, you know, take this new thing, go build something new with it, and it'll work.
Absolutely.
It'll work to a degree, right, that we can guarantee.
Exactly. The contracts, I was going to say,
exactly.
The nice thing about this, the evolution of, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this new world of like, sometimes the gateway is more important than the thing that's underneath. That's why I think we're seeing the rise of things like Hasura, things like Next.js. Next.js is not reinventing React, right? It's giving you a framework for leveraging. And React itself is not reinventing, it's not opinionated, it's giving you the boundaries, it's giving you the dash borders, and it's telling you, you put your stuff here. Another example is the success of React hooks, right? People love React hooks because basically it does nothing. Imagine trying to explain React hooks to my grandmother. Like I would have to use the best metaphors in the world. But developers get really excited about React hooks And the reason I get excited about React Host is because they like how they're being given that boundary to put in their business logic. I see that same thing with the data layer, right? Like, okay, now I get it. I have a resolver, or I have this where I have my type definitions. It's giving me that. It's not even, I wouldn't even say it's very opinionated. Obviously, there's very helpful opinions there. But what you do with it is what makes your business succeed and interesting. I think this is why we're entering this new phase of like that gateway or that high level gateway is even more important than the implementation details.
Yep. That's very true, right? Because some of the building blocks that those implementation details have put together are not kind of going away, right? Like from the Hasura point of view, the databases are awesome. Databases are evolving, right? And they're becoming better and better and better, right? Every single day.
And specialized.
Exactly, right? You have time series workloads in a place, you have transactional workloads here, you have search workloads here, right? You have online analytics at scale, right? It's amazing. And that breadth is just amazing. They're not going to go away, but you need a thing, right? You need a thing to bring that together in the concepts that are relevant for your domain, right? And or at least allow you to develop your domain based on those underlying things, right? When you kind of have seen the adoption specifically for Next.js, right? And especially in kind of legacy, let's say for legacy applications, or let's say in enterprise where adoption of new technology is hard. What have you seen are kind of some of the biggest concerns that people have with adopting new technology, with adopting Next.js? How are you addressing them, or how are you thinking about communicating to them that it's possible, it can happen? How are you and how is the community thinking about that?
There are lots of things there. So first of all, I'll list a few that we've done already that I think were super helpful in enabling a lot of existing enterprises to adopt this stack. So one is Next.js is open source. So that already de-risks so much, right? And obviously I'm preaching to the choir. So the other one is that has this, from day one, we thought about the incremental adoption path. So the Truly example, we worked with them to define this pattern of how can I make only one page be Next.js, the rest is my existing system. And also the next page is being A/B tested. Sometimes when you click login, you're going to the next version. Sometimes you're going to the PHP old version. So we figured that out very early on. And it was part of the design of the system as well. And the other one that is very relevant to this conference is Next was never opinionated about the data layer. We knew that lots of exciting things were coming to market, like GraphQL, new ways of specifying REST APIs, gRPC. There's all these ways of getting data. And we didn't say, okay, like you can only do GraphQL with this framework, or you can only do it over this protocol. We said, okay, data layer is open. And that was super controversial because if you think about some of the most loved technologies of our past decades, like what comes up is like Ruby on Rails. Or if you ask the PHP community, they might say Symfony or some monolithic framework. What those frameworks did is that they were opinionated about the data stack. They were saying like, here's Active Record, and it works really well with Postgres. And we decided not to do that. And that was a huge risk because at the time, people were looking for that. What's going to be the Ruby on Rails of the JS front-end heavy world? And what we say is like, well, it's going to be very different at the end of the day. It's not going to be monolithic, because all these new data layers are coming to market. And people want to separate these things. So I think that investment in separating the concerns, obviously it's people have said this a lot, but it wasn't that obvious 4 or 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, developer adoption meant batteries included for absolutely everything. And now developers don't want batteries. They want batteries included, but they don't want to reinvent each wheel. So you mentioned something really important. You said there's going to be a search database, there's going to be an analytics database, there's going to be a transactional database. So they don't want monolithic anymore. And that is what gave us a lot of tailwind. We captured that direction early on.
No, that's actually amazing, right? And we see One parallel that it was a hard decision for us to make, right? Was when we launched support for and we said, here's a data API, it's powered by GraphQL, it does a bunch of things, and we did authorization, which is such a critical part of the data layer, but we didn't do authentication. Right, and we don't do authentication, and it's such a thing, right? Because it's such a tension, right? Because there's so many different ways of doing authentication, right? There's new ways of doing it. There's so many new experiences on that friction point of authentication that are continuously improving, that it doesn't make sense to try to take an opinion on that, right? It needs to be kind of opened up and let people do. And also the sheer diversity of the ways people authenticate is crazy, right? So
absolutely. And to your point, this is the React hook. What you want to do is you want to figure out, okay, what is the right boundary on top of which people can embed their existing opinions, requirements, and systems of authentication. So that's a way better design than you try to make it easy. Sometimes what I've used this, I call this the day 1, day 10, day 100 pattern. You can get a lot of developers excited with a day 1 solution where authentication is baked in.
Right.
By day 10, they start saying, well, I need feature A, B, and C. They start getting more frustrated. Day 100, they didn't manage to put that system into production because it wasn't flexible enough. So the key trick is that you want to be really good in day 1, really great developer experience, and yet have that, be able to go through that entire journey with the technology.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. And when you kind of think about, we've seen we've seen so much in the in the Next.js ecosystem, in the JavaScript ecosystem, right? And one of the things that you mentioned of the Rails for JavaScript, right? And it's interesting. The Rails for JavaScript thing is really interesting because it seems almost as if the world has changed, right, from where we had technologies like Rails to today. And one of the reasons that a thing like Rails for JavaScript does not seem to exist is possibly or potentially because it's things have gotten so fragmented, right, on both ends that that thinking about it in that manner doesn't make sense anymore, right? And the piece in the middle that makes sense for all is HTTP, right? Is HTTP and JSON, right? That's kind of emerging as a standard. Everything else can sort of come and go, but HTTP and JSON will stay, right? That has kind of become one kind of lingua franca there. And of course, the move towards stateless, right? And where HTTP fits in really well, right? Where you can have either the Next.js application or the functions that are using stuff. They're stateless, which makes it so convenient to do stuff.
Absolutely. We're seeing that with the success of serverless, right? There might or might not be a piece of compute allocated for a particular website in every one of our edge regions. There might or might not be. We don't know. We don't know if in a certain e-commerce store is going to launch something that goes viral tomorrow in Canada. So that's the world we live in. We live in a world of memes and social media and traffic spikes and virality. So the answer is you don't pre-allocate compute everywhere at once. Instead, what you do is you come from this point of view of edge compute that's stateless. It can react immediately to traffic surges. It can react. It can also react immediately in the sense of you're deploying it immediately, right? Something that we get a lot of praise for with Next and Vercel is that how quickly you can push and deploy a new experiment to production. So that velocity serverless has comes with this idea of I'm not going to have this connection pool to my PostgreSQL monolith that takes 5 seconds to instantiate, that I have to configure a health check for when the database is ready. No, the database is always ready. It's a global data layer, and it uses a stateless protocol with fast, cold connections and instantiations.
Right. And HTTP's figured that out, right? And so absolutely. So being able to do that over HTTP, right, means that you can leverage so much of that infrastructure, right? So
I'm so excited about HTTP 3 because I'm seeing this world of I'm spinning up a piece of compute at the edge in less than 5 milliseconds. I'm connecting statelessly, but with no latency to the Hasura edge. And I'm streaming data in HTML and JS to the client, anywhere in the world instantaneously with no pre-allocated resources much
Yep.
with infinite
Yep.
scale. And
Yep.
we're almost there, but still, like, there's a lot of really awesome protocol work, serverless edge compute work that we're doing to like make that faster, make that more flexible, but we're getting there.
Yep. No, that's awesome. The last thing I wanted to touch upon was, we've seen so many amazing innovations and such a rapid pace of kind of evolution of things, and from ideas to even infrastructure ideas, right? As builders of infrastructures, as contributors to infrastructure, we've seen so many amazing ideas get into production, but a lot of it is so much around the web, right? Like, what does all this for you and for your users? What do you see? What it means for the mobile ecosystem, and how does the mobile ecosystem compare? What kinds of things are you excited about on that side of things?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, I think the world that we're in is extremely diverse and is going to stay extremely diverse. So that's why I think this separation between the front end layer and the data layer makes so much sense, right? You don't know what the next customer of your data, what the next platform is going to be. It might be a new type of mobile application. It might be AR. It might be Neuralink. So I think that separation is here to stay. What I also think is true is that these patterns that the web has invented are the best patterns for the most business-friendly patterns,
right?
For creating and investing in a product. So a good example is that I should be able to experiment by pushing code to the edge without going through an expensive and slow app store review process. I think it's an invariant of the universe, and we are headed in that direction, whether it's apparent or not. So I think this idea of, I think what I always stick with is, what are the things that are not going to change about the future? I think what's not going to change is that we want to go to buy something online or consume some content or get in touch with a friend, and that transaction has to happen immediately. That means we're going to use a global web of data and compute that gets access instantly. What I also think about is that developers will try to reuse and reinvest what they have already created. And that's why I think React has been such a durable technology. I think React components are like investing in a really good stock, right? Like, and then reinvesting the returns, because it keeps getting better over time, and everyone in the company can reuse it. And the same goes with hooks and with components, and with React Server components are coming. So I think that's also not going to change. So I think the world that we're going to go in the future is going to be very much this hybrid world of layers of different components of different sophistication that can get repurposed to different platforms. But the deployment model and the latency that consumers are going to be interested in, that's going to be universal. We're going to be getting our data and our compute from the edge. We're going to be deploying and experimenting constantly. And we're going to be trying to reuse as much of this component layer as we can in all our initiatives.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I'm sure, as me and most people in the world are excited about kind of fast forwarding that future as much as possible, right? So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's an amazing thing. But that's our time. Thank you so much for spending time with us, Guillermo, and excited for all of the work that's going to come. Excited for all of the innovations on the web that's going to happen, and thanks again for joining us. And
thank you for having me.
See you again soon. Yeah.